Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, way back in 2016, when the world was a very different place, I interviewed Brett McDowell about the FIDO Alliance and how they were working to eradicate passwords. But I was recently offered a timely reminder of that conversation when I read that FIDO had released their plans to accelerate the global charge beyond passwords. And research has shown that, yes, 30 to 40% of people might think, passwords are all right for me and I've got a great system in place, but no matter how great that password is, or your system is, it still has the potential to be stolen. So the FIDO Alliance recognised the need for service provider help with user experience. And for FIDO to really take off, they needed some common elements to drive that change. And at community level, they wanted best practices, so consumers would actually log in and do the same. So the result was top design engineers with UX leads from companies such as Visa, Wells Fargo, Facebook, JP Morgan Chase and Microsoft were all involved in shaping these new UX guidelines and formed a UX task force. So we have a lot to catch up on. So today I've invited Andrew Shikiar onto the podcast, who's going to share the exciting vision of authentication in the future, the work that FIDO Alliance are doing, and much more. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to Los Angeles, where Andrew is waiting to speak with us now. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It's great to be here. My name is Andrew Shikiar. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Marketing Officer at FIDO Alliance. In that role, I lead organizational strategy for FIDO Alliance, especially focused on our outbound engagements and all things related to driving market adoption of FIDO technology.
And I'm really looking forward to delving into FIDO technology in a few moments. Some great work that you're doing there. But before we do, can I ask that you share your origin story, where your passion for tech and ridding the world of passwords came from, and ultimately what put you on this path you're on today?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And actually, I was just talking to my kids about this. Or, Daddy, and they're younger, and they're asking me if I always knew I wanted to be a FIDO worker, is what they call me. And I said, no, I didn't know I was going to be a FIDO worker. But it's an interesting thing. And I've been very fortunate in my career to have been around, a variety of emerging technologies at their inception, and also to have had, a lot of strong mentors. But from a tech standpoint, I moved out to Silicon Valley and became part of the initial marketing team for Java at Sun Microsystems way back in the mid '90s, and that was a really great opportunity at a younger age to be around these brilliant people and seeing how simple technology, or not a simple technology, how a new technology could change everything, right? And being around these brilliant engineers and seeing the Java developer community explode, they're really a cool experience. Seeing that. I then, left Sun to be a founding team at one of the first email marketing technology providers. So another kind of industry at its inception. Came back to Sun to help launch something called FIDO Alliance, which was the first industry consortia working on federated identity, and then went on to help launch Sun's identity solution set. So that was my first exposure to identity back in 2001, so 20 years ago now. And since then, I got into mobile platforms, mobile devices. That's the kind of the inception of the smartphone era. Dabbled in machine learning for a bit, but ultimately, I think all of this boils back down to identity. Whether you're talking about machine learning, marketing, digital marketing, things like that, it's all the same questions that when I was at Sun in 2001, introducing that concept of identity. I'd go out with our sales teams and we'd meet with, our top customers, CIOs and CTOs, and we'd ask some simple questions, which would be like, well, what does identity mean to you? What's identity mean to your business, to your employees, to your customers, to your partners? And these questions are still quite relevant today. And I think we could actually extend that question set to now ask things about, What does identity mean to your competitors or to your attackers or hackers? So the concept of identity has, I think matured, but the imperative behind securing identities has grown. And so it's been really interesting for me personally to have, been in this industry at its inception, and I've come back into it over the past, 6-7 years, and seeing frankly that a lot of the same concepts we were talking about, I got out of this space in 2007, we're still being discussed by a lot of the same people. But I do feel like, over the past 2 or 3 years, due to advances in technology and other things that, the identity, that the pace of identity innovation and things happening in digital identity are happening at a much more rapid clip than they ever have before. So it's a super exciting time to be in this space.
And I love the journey that you've been on here. And a lot of people won't realise that identity has dominated conversations in the industry for over 20 years now. And for people listening outside of the industry, can you just set the scene and tell the listeners a little bit more about what the FIDO Alliance is and the mission that you're on?
Yeah, absolutely. So FIDO Alliance it's an industry consortia. We have around 250 members worldwide, and a group of companies working to create open standards and an interoperable set of products for simpler, stronger user authentication. So it was founded back in 2013, really to help address the data breach problem. And if you look at the leading cause of data breaches, it's passwords, right? And so it makes sense then that FIDO would focus on how can we get rid of this very persistent pain and this ongoing threat to businesses with something that's a better means of allowing users to log into systems and services. So FIDO as a body, we do 3 core things. First and foremost, we create technical specifications. All right, so we've created technical specifications for biometric authentication, for second factor authentication. We're now doing work in IoT. We're doing work in identity verification. But what we do with our specs, since we're not a formal standards body per se, we actually submit them for formal standardization, right? So we collaborated with W3C on our FIDO 2 standards, which includes something called the WebAuthn or Web Authentication specification. We've also submitted our standards to ISO and ITU and other bodies that are really important for gaining global awareness and support, especially as you look at many of our vendors sell into regulated industries. So we create specifications. That's the first thing. The second thing we do is we run a certification program. And frankly, I like to say that specifications without certification are like one hand clapping. And what's that mean, right? And so we test for a couple things. We verify that products are meeting the specifications or built to the specifications. But then very importantly, we also test for interoperability. And this is what really unlocks the power of standards for the enterprise. It allows you to have a heterogeneous architecture, allows you to have, kind of plug and play systems, throughout your identity stack, all the way out to, your employees or your customers' authenticator. So the FIDO certified program has really grown into, quite a large endeavor. We have, I think, over 900 products now FIDO certified. Additionally, the third thing we do is kind of market engagement, market education. And that's, doing things like this. So talking to you, having these sorts of opportunities. But also we have working groups inside the organization that are basically like many user groups, if you will, looking at different deployment scenarios. So we have a consumer deployment working group. We have an enterprise deployment working group, government deployment working group. And these are largely, deploying organizations and some vendors who, share best practices, both internally, but also document them and we write up white papers for external consumption as well. So I think it's very important to, help companies kind of give them blueprints for how they can be successful deploying FIDO passwordless authentication solutions.
I grew up dreaming of hoverboards, jetpacks after watching the LA Olympics back in 1984, flying cars, and maybe even a passwordless future. And I did speak with, I think it was Brett McDowell about FIDO's mission back in 2016. But obviously there's still so much work that needs to be done. So my question to you is, we'll have people listening all over the world, and we are living in a divisive and polarized world at the moment. But I think one thing that everyone can agree on is that we all hate passwords. So what is holding us back from getting there, do you think?
Yeah, I often get this question, like, when will we be passwordless? I've never heard it compared to when will we be flying with jetpacks. And I'm hoping that, the passwordless future comes faster than the jetpack full future. When will we get there? I mean, so pieces are in place today. I mean, ultimately, why is it taking so long? Is a fair question.
Yeah.
And it's a theme that we talk about quite a bit, actually. The simple answer to why it's taking so long is that it's hard. This is hard work. Passwords are part of the DNA of the web itself, right? It's ingrained behavior. When you go to a new website, you automatically look for the username password box. People are accustomed to doing that. And while, yes, we by and large do hate passwords, around 30 to 40% of people prefer using passwords because it's a known thing. It's a known evil. It's a known, thing that people do. So we have to do a couple things, right? First, we have to change user behavior. But ultimately, we need to work to change the DNA of the web itself, which is a non-trivial activity. The good news is we're making progress there, right? And I think to become the DNA of the web, you need to do three things to get there. First, you need to have industry-wide coalescence behind what you're doing, right? Everyone needs to be on board with what you're aiming to do. Think about Bluetooth, for example.
Yeah.
Bluetooth is now synonymous with streaming technology, streaming audio, whatever it might be, but that was industry coalescence behind that standard. Likewise with FIDO, really everybody who has a stake in the future of the internet and the future of the digital economies is taking part in FIDO Alliance. Apple joined FIDO at the beginning of 2020, sitting on our board. That was a very powerful signal to the rest of the marketplace, to governments, to regulators, that everyone who's talking about strong user authentication is doing so inside of FIDO Alliance. So I think we can demonstrate that strong industry support behind FIDO. The second key thing we have to do to become part of the DNA of the web is to be available at scale, right? So the one thing passwords have going for them is that they're ubiquitous. Everyone can use them. Everyone knows what they are. It's just part of what people do. And to supplant that, FIDO needs to be there as well. The good news, again, is that every major device now shipping supports FIDO authentication, right? So every MacBook being unboxed, every laptop, every Android phone, the vast majority of modern computing devices support FIDO authentication. And on the other side of that, in addition to devices, being able to consume FIDO authentication, we need builders to be able to build with FIDO, right? And so there's a good developer story as well as part of the FIDO 2 spec. This thing called WebAuthn or Web Authentication. It's an open API, open standard that any developer can point to rely on strong authentication rather than passwords or SMS OTP. Now, the third key thing, coming back to my list for changing the DNA of the web, the third thing I would say is regulatory embrace, government embrace, right? So you don't need regulation to drive technical change, but it certainly helps. And we've done a lot of work to engage with and educate governments on the benefits of FIDO's approach to strong authentication, in the sense that it's privacy preserving, it's unphishable, it's very strong, and it's readily available, and it's open. And more and more, we're seeing governments actually cite FIDO as the best practice for both government deployments, for e-citizen services, and we also make sure to comply with things like GDPR, PSD2, and other emerging open banking standards. So, I think as we move forward, all three of these things, FIDO is now well positioned to address this password problem, right? So going back to the first discussion you had in 2016, or 8 years before that, when people were predicting the death of password, pieces are now in place, and movements are now happening to really move us all to that post-password world. And one development I will point to of note is something Apple announced at their Worldwide Developer Conference this past summer. They announced something called Apple Passkeys. It was kind of, wasn't one of the lead stories coming out of there, but for us, it was very critical. And what they basically announced is that they're going to introduce something called Passkeys, which will be deployed across the iCloud keychain, which will, instead of setting up a username password on websites, you'll now set up basically FIDO key pairs, right? And that's what FIDO's aiming to do. It's fundamentally changed the way authentication happens from server-side shared secrets like passwords to using public key cryptography, which puts a public key on the server and a private key on the device. And that's what Apple's going to be commercializing with passkeys. So, I think we've seen in the past that Apple has successfully commercialized advanced technology concepts and security concepts like Touch ID or Face ID. And the exciting thing is that, by working inside of FIDO Alliance, we see the other major platforms collaborating with Apple and following suit with their own plans for really bringing FIDO authentication to the masses. So Google, Microsoft, and others are all working on other kind of standards-based approaches to doing the same thing.
It's incredibly cool. And one of the reasons I was excited about getting you on the podcast today was having read how FIDO recently released its first user experience guidelines and new FIDO 2 standards enhancements that are all aimed at accelerating the world's move beyond passwords. And just to put this into perspective, we're talking over 4 billion devices, all major browsers and operating systems now supporting FIDO authentications. So for any developers or decision makers listening, can you tell me a little bit more about how this release will actually make it even easier for service providers and enterprises to ultimately provide that simple phishing resistant and privacy enhancing sign-in experience that as consumers we're all craving right now?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that goes back to the last question as well. Yeah. What do we have to do to make this change?
Yeah.
And you reference over 4 billion devices and all browsers. And so, we've achieved what I'll call that endpoint ubiquity, right? And we now have tools for developers to use as well. But one thing, we found, and we heard this from the service providers in the Alliance, so the big banks, big enterprises, is that, well, look, technology is not enough. Like, what's the best way to do this? Like, at the end of the day, yes, not using a password is easier than using a password, but how do you educate consumers on this? And how do you actually optimize the user journey? And as we dug into it, it turns out it's a very complex issue, both from trying to get someone to enroll what I'll call a biometric authenticator on a desktop. So to be clear, this study focused on using Touch ID on a MacBook or Windows Hello on a PC, right? So these are available tools that anyone can use instead of a password. But how do you educate consumers on encourage them to opt in for this and let them feel confident and happy with this new means of authentication? And so we tested everything from design, so iconography, to messaging, to education steps. And it's a very extensive study, and it rolled into these UX guidelines, which are now freely available on our website, which really is a cookbook, if you will, for any service provider looking to deploy FIDO in an optimal way. And so it's data-driven guidance, and we think it's really going to help a lot of companies, be more comfortable and more successful with their FIDO implementations. We had a lot of really big brands taking part in the study, and these are, some of the biggest brands in the world, and they tend to have massive design and testing resources. But for the longer tail of service providers who either don't have those resources or don't have interest in those resources, this is also meant for them, right? This is something that you can simply follow these guidelines, with your FIDO deployments to make sure that you're putting yourselves in the best position for your customers to opt in and successfully leverage FIDO authentication.
And I think traditionally developers have been accused of treating authentication almost as an afterthought. But right now we're living in a digital world of one-click checkouts and seamless experiences where we hop from device to device on things like Netflix or Spotify, etc. So I'm curious, do you think this is changing with the top design engineers and UX leads from companies such as big names like Visa, Facebook, JP Morgan Chase and Microsoft, etc., all being involved in shaping these new UX guidelines and forming that UX task force? Are you noticing real changes as a result of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think so. So there's two things to think about. One is kind of the technical development, and the other part is the design aspect. And saying authentication has been treated as an afterthought is pretty spot on, but it's not because developers don't care about it.
Yeah.
But to do advanced authentication is very difficult. And what FIDO brings is basically advanced, cryptographic, security for user logins that was prohibitively difficult to do before, right? So with WebAuthn, you now get the advanced crypto without having to know how to do advanced cryptography, right? So again, it's a public API that does all the hard work for the developer. So for the first time, there's now a better way to do this. So I think that's incredibly powerful. And what's really cool, actually, is that we're seeing a number of SDKs and platforms and open source communities fully embrace this. So the tooling out there is becoming more prevalent, more optimized, and just more readily available for developers to leverage web authentication, FIDO authentication, rather than defaulting to passwords or traditional multi-factor authentication like SMS OTP, which is not user-friendly and also insecure. So I think from a technical standpoint and security standpoint, yes, that's a big addition. And then from a design standpoint, yeah, that comes back to the UX guidelines. And we had the design leads from these big brands that you mentioned helping shape this program. We've had hundreds of downloads of the UX guidelines document, and we try to seek out people who are using it to get their feedback. And I spoke last week with one of the banks, actually, that's on our task force, and I was asking that lead, well, have you guys used this, and what's the reception been? And the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Her team actually built this into, they had like an internal hackathon, if you will, for their next gen authentication products, and they won best UX and best design by following these guidelines. So, to me, that's really good validation that in addition to having the kind of technical underpinnings in place, we're now layering on added value by helping people, be successful with their design and messaging for FIDO authentication.
And a friend of mine recently asked me to help restore a backup from an old phone onto their new phone. I was having a few problems, and I got involved, and they said, I said, what's your App Store or Apple iCloud account password? And the reply I'll always remember that she said, well, I don't need to remember my password because my fingerprint or my face remembers it on my phone. So it shows you just how things have changed there. But are you seeing a shared appetite in the industry by anyone offering an online service to help remove that friction and eliminate the reliance on passwords? Yeah,
from the B2B standpoint, yes. Right. So I don't know if that's where you're going with the question or not. But yeah, I talked before about the FIDO certified ecosystem. There's hundreds of products that are FIDO certified, but if I'm an enterprise looking to introduce passwordless to my customers or my employees, you can work with any one of these vendors to offer these, hosted, often they're cloud hosted solutions that can get you up and running with a passwordless approach, quite quickly. Frankly, a lot of the challenge in going passwordless is the technical debt that some companies have, if you will. Legacy systems are hard to remove, hard to replace, hard to upgrade. So we're seeing some pretty innovative approaches to kind of adding a layer, if you will, around one's infrastructure to allow for a passwordless approach on top of that. I've got to ask, how challenging is it creating a passwordless ecosystem that can replace all the passwords functionality, but without leaving behind the billions of people who don't own a smartphone or multiple devices? And I ask that on behalf of my mother, who doesn't get my obsession with technology and embracing everything when she feels she's getting left behind sometimes. Yeah, and that's a great question. And and we can have a whole podcast just on this topic. Yeah. So a couple of reflections. First of all, from a raw technical standpoint, you don't necessarily need a smartphone or multiple devices to use FIDO authentication. So the core to FIDO, and we haven't really gone that deep on the tech, but again, the fundamental thing that FIDO is trying to do is shift authentication from a method that is dependent on server-side shared secrets, like passwords, to one that is more decentralized in nature, where you're authenticating locally to your device. And typically you think of Touch ID or Face ID or anything local like a biometric, which requires a smartphone. But what's actually just as secure as that is a PIN, a 4-digit PIN, is something that is proving possession. So anything that's possession-based can meet the FIDO requirements. And the reason why that's important is that it prevents kind of the remote scalable attacks that are, have been the plague to the industry in the past, right? So whether that's phishing attacks, whether that is remote hackers or social engineering to manipulate someone's password out of their brains or out of their fingers, or out of their fingertips, if you will, by man-in-the-middle attack. Any form of remote authentication is high risk. Local authentication is more secure. So that could be a simple PIN. In India, for example, MasterCard introduced something called Identity Check Express, I think is the name of it, which basically allows consumers in India, right now, if you're a consumer in India, any purchase over, I forget the number, but X number of rupees requires a second factor authentication. And it always comes by SMS message. SMS, as we know, has reliability issues, it has security issues, and a host of other challenges associated with it. They allow users on kind of more remedial devices just to use a PIN. So use your device PIN to authenticate yourself rather than having to take action on an SMS on an OTP message. That's a very roundabout way of saying that FIDO can scale down to very simple mobile devices. So I think it's possible. But if we come back to this question, like how do we avoid leaving people behind? I think it's really a critical question for everyone to think about, not just about passwords, but about digital identity in general, right? If you think about like the migrant situation that's been so prevalent in the Middle East and now exacerbated in Afghanistan, how do you manage identities for people who may not have an identity? And even in first world countries like the UK or the US, this is a big problem. I saw someone speak at a summit I was speaking at also, a guy by the name of Reverend Ben Roberts, and there's an identity mission. He's a reverend for a church in Washington D.C., but they have what they call the identity mission, identity gospel. I forget what it is, but they're very focused. They're keenly aware of this problem, and are focused on helping people who come from shattered backgrounds, who may have lost their identity documents, who might not be able to get digital services, government services, to provide them with the resources they need to get back online. And if you think about the challenge associated with that, and this is far beyond the issue of passwords, if you're trying to build your life back up and you come from a shattered background, how do you do that? How do you prove your credentials to get government assistance, to get government housing, whatever you might need to get yourself in a better place? So I think it's something that I'd love to see the industry at large take more of a awareness of and see what they can do to help the people at the margins of society, help themselves with digital resources.
It's such an important point to make there, and also fascinating how the topic of identity that you started with there over 20 years ago, and how identity is continuing to evolve is fascinating. So I'm going to ask you to look into your virtual crystal ball and ask, what do you think the future of passwords, or should I say, what does the future of authentication look like?
Yeah, it's seamless. So sometimes I ask the question the other week, like, how will we know when the passwordless feature is here? And my answer is, I don't think you will, because authentication will become more seamless. Another way of looking at it is, I think the key to the future authentication is to forget what you know, right? So forget having to know, knowledge-based authentication needs to go by the wayside. Possession-based authentication, which is based on something you hold or who you are, needs to come to the fore. And I think that's what the future authentication looks like, whether it's just using your biometric or other signals about you, using machine learning, things like that. I think that, as soon as we move to, those forms of authentication, not only will it be a more seamless user experience, but it'll be a far more secure and safe for internet than we have today.
And we started the conversation talking about your origin story, but now I'm going to have a little bit of fun with you before I let you go and ask you, what was the soundtrack to that origin story? Is there a song that has inspired you or helped you throughout your career, or just helps you gets your head in the zone so we can put it on our Spotify playlist? Is there a song and story you can leave us with?
That was the toughest question of all these questions. I thought, like many people, I assume I have a very diverse set of musical taste, and you can catch me listening to anything from like Jerry Garcia to like gangster rap. So that's a tough question. There's one song I do like listening to, like when I kind of zone out on if I'm traveling or whatnot, by a guy by the name of Mark Lanigan. He used to be the front man for the Screaming Trees and a couple other bands out of Seattle, which is where I'm from originally. But a song called Strange Religion. It's kind of a little morose, but it's a song I could play on repeat for some time, just kind of listen to it and zone out and get my head a little bit. And Just a really interesting little song.
Love that. That must have been incredibly cool, being at the perfect age during that whole Seattle grunge scene.
It was. I mean, it was actually cool being, I was coming out of high school, in the late 80s, early 90s, and that's when all that music was coming into the fore. And then actually went to college in the Southeast when the kind of the roots music, like the old Dave Matthews and Widespread Panic and all those bands were coming out. So I had a little taste of both two of them at the same time, and they still both two genres, drive my musical tastes.
Love that. And finally, before I let you go, for anyone listening that would like to find out more information about FIDO Alliance, the work you're doing, or contact your team, what's the best starting point?
Yeah, well, FIDOalliance.org is their website. We're on every social media channel. You can just do a simple web search on FIDO Alliance. I would plug the fact that we're having we've launched a public conference called Authenticate. And so this is an event we're having in Seattle, Washington, October 18th to 20th, but there's also a hybrid participation. So anyone who doesn't want to travel or cannot travel can attend remotely. I'd highly recommend checking it out, attending. We had the interest we had in this event was overwhelming. So we put out a call for papers. We probably had 4 times as many submissions as we had space to take them all. So if you're interested in learning more about FIDO, either the basics of how FIDO works, but more importantly, hearing from people who have deployed FIDO inside an enterprise to consumers, in government, we're going to have dozens of case studies involved in this conference. So I'd encourage people to check that out, as well as the core FIDO web and social assets.
Awesome. I'll add the links to that on the show notes so people can find that nice and easily and get involved. I think you've probably heard just about every single question about authentication and going passwordless and passwordless ecosystems. But today we managed to wrap it up in your origin story, song of choice, jetpacks and flying cars. But more than anything, thank you for sharing that with me.
Neil, thank you. Thanks so much.
The fact that authentication is moving towards less dependence on knowledge and more on inherent authentication has to be a great thing, right? And letting people log in the same way that they unlock their devices and make access easy enough for everyone by offering a standardized way of doing it, again, exciting stuff. And please remember, every device that you open right now has FIDO, so I do urge you to check them out. But over to you. Please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. You can get me on Twitter at Neil C. Hughes and LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk. And if you want to see pics of my recent trip to Croatia, you can connect with me on Instagram too at Neil C. Hughes. So keep those questions and connection requests and pictures to come on the show coming. And I'll return tomorrow with another great guest. So a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.